All right, so today's topic, or topics, it's kind of two very intertwined ones, is going to be borders and immigration, which at the time of this recording is one of the biggest hot button topics. And I'll start it off with an argument ad absurdum. I would like to come across the table and penetrate your body and have sex with you. Are you okay with that?
You know, as much as I like you, that's a little much for me.
Okay, so there's a border around your body, at least the immediate vicinity of your body, that you're not okay with other people crossing.
Right.
Unless they have permission.
Yes.
All right, so borders to some degree, I think most people would agree, are acceptable.
I would agree with that.
Okay, and I think that the topic of rape will be a different podcast. We'll do that later on. But for now, let's stick to borders. All right. Around you, there is an imaginary border around your immediate body. What about personal space? Because that is technically a border as well. Do you have personal space? Do you think that you have the right to limit people's intrusion into your personal space?
I think there definitely needs to be a level of that. You know, if you're going to a concert or something, people are definitely going to be really close to you. But in general, I don't always want somebody on top of me.
Or uncomfortably close.
Right.
So how would you define your personal space, though?
I think that's tricky because sometimes it is going to be a whole lot larger than other times. You know, if I'm walking down the street in the middle of the night, not a whole lot of lights, I would much rather have more space between me and the person I am walking behind in many cases.
And the people that you know well, you are going to be much more comfortable with them being close.
Exactly.
If you and I sit down together and we happen to be in physical contact, that would be very different than if you're on a subway and someone just randomly sits down next to you when there's no one else in the train. That would be a little more concerning.
Right.
So not knowing who's intruding on what you view as your personal space or your known space, I think that's the better way of looking at it, is the space where you know what's going on. When someone comes into that, there's a sense of danger. There's an inherent sense of danger.
Exactly.
And I think that that's the primary reason that we set up borders. Is it's not to say this is an impenetrable barrier, but it's a space that we know what's going on, and there's a risk of not knowing what's going on when unknown individuals come in.
That makes sense.
So what if we expand that out to, let's say, your home? Because personal space is still directly related to an individual. In your home, there's usually multiple individuals, and that's where we start getting more into the idea of a community. So how should homes be protected? And a border around your home tends to be more defined. So
right. You've got walls and a door.
Right. So to what degree are those borders enforceable?
I think definitely your own living space, interior, is significantly more enforceable than exterior. As much as you can put a fence around your yard, chances are your front yard is going to be open to the street. People might walk through it, maybe try to pick your flowers, but there's a little bit less you can do than on the inside, where you can say, okay, this is a room, there's one door. It is a lot easier to look at who is coming through that door.
But even that assumes that you can have ownership over an area, over a property, over a plot of land, and a lot of cultures don't assume that you have ownership, that you are residing in a particular region, but you don't own that piece of land. So I can't think that across cultures, you can't assume that land ownership is a way of defining borders, because not all cultures agree to the idea or the concept that land can be owned.
That's fair. And in larger cases, if you're thinking more than just a single home, what about the borders of a city? I certainly don't own all of the city that we live in.
Or even the apartment complex.
Right.
That you have designated to you a particular area of that apartment complex, but other areas, in the hallways, the communal hallways, those are more acceptable for multiple people to be in. But even then, a lot of times apartment complexes have locks on their doors. So you increase the restrictiveness of the area as you get lower and lower in level. So At the home, you're restricted to a couple of people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a family's worth of people inside of a residence. Inside of the building, where in the case of an apartment complex or a condo, anyone that happens to live there, even from different families, is allowed there, but it would be suspicious if other individuals from outside of that pushed their way in.
Right.
And then as we go further out in cities tend to be, yeah, okay, you're here, you can go to this city, you can go to the next city. The flow of people from city to city generally is less restricted.
Yes, that is true.
And generally because not all countries actually follow that. There are countries that will severely limit your mobility, especially in times of war, but I think we're talking in just
more peacetime.
Yeah, mostly borders and how they relate to peacetime. So what about for communist areas where you are supposed to have a community and not really have personal ownership of things? Ironically, communist countries still have borders and established borders, but within those borders, there tend to be fewer. So how can that work in terms of protecting people's rights? What rights do you have, assuming that there are no borders between individuals that share your same values?
Well, in that case, even then, as a person, I would feel more comfortable having some space to call my own for sleeping, for example. I don't necessarily want somebody else to encroach on that space. I would want to feel safe as I'm sleeping because I can't defend myself.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be some sort of border in there.
Or at least some sort of protection that leaves you with a feeling of safety.
Right. Because otherwise, that's not going to be fun for anybody.
And in the case where there are a bunch of people that are all acting as a community that can protect each other, you can have 20 people in a room, and assuming that you trust those people, you can feel safe.
Exactly.
And in which case that personal space border becomes less important.
Right. And your bubble kind of shrinks a little bit.
And I think whether you're in a communist society or, I don't want to say free society, but a free society, that sense of community is going to be very similar. The idea that a country is kind of the largest aspect of our culture that we look at of, you are all part of this country, which means that we share a certain cultural goal, and therefore there's a certain level of trust that we have with other individuals that share that culture. And I believe that the number is from studies done of how many people can you have together that you still trust or have a personal connection with. It's something like 1 or 200. And beyond that, you no longer really have a personal connection with them, which is probably also why we see suburbs tend to be around if people get together for a suburban get-together, it's around 1 or 200 people.
And that's also typically about the size of an apartment building.
Or office buildings. You have a couple of hundred people, and that gives you a sense of community and a sense of trust of, I have been at least in proximity to these people. They probably share a lot of my values, and therefore I'm more comfortable with them in my space, and I trust them to help protect us as a group. And I think that that's not specific to humans even. That idea of a border is a communal border is in the animal kingdom as well. You see that with lions and prides.
Yep. Elephants are another one.
Yep. And they protect their own, and elephants from other herds or lions from other prides may be looked at as enemies. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because trust has not been built up. And I think that that's the key point here about borders is you establish a border around that which you have trust in. Or at least that you have established some degree of trust. So for instance, in the United States, we have states, and then between the states we do have borders, but they're all within the United States border. So the state is a definition of, within this border, we have agreed to these terms and these laws, and we can communicate to other states through the federal government, which is also within, at least we still follow a lot of the same laws, but that allows us to limit the community to something at least more limited than the 300 some odd million people that live in the United States, down to ones or tens of millions of people in the state.
And this makes sense. As you get larger and larger groups of people together, say looking at the United States of 300-something million people, it's really hard for us all to come to a conclusion that we can all agree with.
As is exemplified in a lot of the presidential elections.
Exactly. So keeping those communities smaller helps a lot to make sure everybody has similar morals, similar goals, and come up with things that make sense for their own community.
And that's the idea of local governments, that they have the most specific laws pertaining to those specific groups of people, and it's easier to change because it doesn't apply to as many people, versus on the state level, it becomes more difficult, but that's because it applies to more people, so it's slower to change. And on the federal government level, it's as wide of a net as you can cast, but it covers all of the people in that country. So as you start affecting more and more people, the process through which you can set aside rules and laws should slow down to make sure that those laws are as accurate as possible because of the number of people's lives that they affect.
Right. And in the case of your small community, your city, you definitely want to have a border to say, okay, these are the people who belong to my city and my laws will affect, to make it easier to define that group who can actually make those laws.
And it's a democratic idea of that the people that exist within a certain area and within a certain border should be the ones deciding what rules they follow.
Right.
So we are kind of making assumptions that these are self-governed people as opposed to having a monarchy of some sort. So what about that? What if you do have a monarchy and you end up building walls to protect the people? Does that change the fact that you should have borders?
I mean, even then, if you have a monarchy, you kind of need to know the people you rule over. So on more of a nationwide scale, you're going to need borders.
And granted, that also means that with kingships, you want to rule over more people for whatever reason, even if that... I don't want to attribute evil to kingships, because a lot of times they may legitimately believe that I want to help as many people as possible, and in order to do that, I need to increase the size of my borders to encompass more people and help more people. So I think out of a desire to do good, it would be reasonable to assume that kingships, or really any country that believes they're doing good, should expand their borders.
But in the world we are in today, expanding your borders means that you are taking people and land from some other country. Is that really right?
If you're trying to do good, is that bad?
I think part of it also depends on the definition of good. If your country's good is the other country's bad, is that really worth it?
I think this is something that we see a lot with foreign interference. For instance, with first world countries going into third world countries and trying to affect their governments. It's not really an invasion force, not specifically, but you are sending the military in to try and overthrow governments, to put up one that is similar to yours, but hopefully with the individuals that are there. It's a weird form of colonization that has been cropping up, particularly with the United States and foreign interference. But I don't think that the United States is, say, increasing the size of their borders. I think it's that we're trying to spread the ideas as opposed to expanding the borders.
I think that makes sense in this case, because in a lot of those countries where the United States is interfering, we're trying to give them their own government and put them in a place where they could govern themselves and create these communities.
But the idea of self-governance is still the idea that we're spreading.
Right.
So with self-governance still comes borders, because you can only self-govern the people that agree to self-govern. Now, does that mean that as more and more countries self-govern, does the need for borders decrease? So, for instance, what's happening in the EU, in Europe, inter-country travel is fairly regular because they're all mostly democratic and borders don't mean as much. So I think the EU is a very good example because they're relatively close in terms of distance, should they have borders there, and what purpose do they serve in the EU?
I think one of the interesting things about the EU is that a single country there is often roughly the same size as a U.S. state, and sometimes significantly smaller.
Approximately.
So in a way, a lot of those EU countries are more similar to U.S. states. A lot of the countries over there have very similar ideas in a lot of cases, and can agree on some general things, which is similar to what we see with the U.S. government, where a lot of our federal laws are things that everybody in the United States can agree with. They may not have quite as many laws as you would see on the state level, because there are some things that are extremely controversial across the United States, but there are some things that all states can agree with. So in that way, the EU is almost similar to the United States, just by a different name.
Specifically the federal government.
Right.
I think that there's a critical difference there, though. And that's that in Europe, a lot of the cultural development took place, and that's what set up the borders. It wasn't divvying up land per se. It was rise of very different cultures. For instance, Germany and France. I think most people would be able to look at French culture and recognize it as distinct and very distinct from German culture. It's not to say that one is superior to the other, but they are very different. And that's what the France-Germany border is. It signifies where the culture is most defined to change. On the border, you're going to see a lot more overlap. But as you go more towards the center of the country, there's going to be a much bigger cultural difference. So I think that when most people think of borders, they think of laws and ownership of land. But I don't think that's accurate. I think a border represents... we have to draw a line somewhere, because otherwise it's just a blur. And a lot of what we talk about is there's no such thing as a well-defined line. But when it comes down to it, we have to deal with these minute situations. So, for instance, if someone breaks a law that is legal to one culture but illegal to another culture, how do you try them? Well, where were they when it took place? And having a well-defined border is, I think, important for determining that. But
Right.
But bringing it back to the idea of borders being culturally defined. If you look, for instance, in the United States, different states tend to have different cultural opinions.
Yes, and sometimes they can be drastically different. People in Texas have very different ideas than people who live in New York.
Absolutely. Politically, religiously, everything. They live in different areas and different climates and have different heritages. That's the correct plural, right?
I think so.
Yeah. In New York, there's more colonial heritage, and in Texas, there's a lot of Spanish heritage and more Western. When you think of old Westerns, cowboys and stuff, that's more of their heritage, which you wouldn't see a lot of cowboys in New York. So the different heritages lead to different cultures. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, it's not to say that one culture is better than another culture. They're just different. And so there should be a border somewhere between New York and Texas, and there happen to be a lot of borders because there are a lot of different cultures between there.
Right. But how is that much different than France and Germany? Because, you see a cowboy, you are thinking much more Texas than New York.
And I think that's fair. I think it's different in the sense that we use different words for them. That Germany and France have a similar level of differentiation between people who live in New York and people who live in Texas, besides the fact that between Texas and New York, there's still a primary language that they share. Germany and France don't. So I think the language barrier is a huge barrier that is one of the reasons that borders are helpful, is determining, okay, what language should I expect to need to know if I'm moving around within this border. So I think that's part of it. But beyond that, like we mentioned earlier, countries in Europe are more like states in the U.S., and the EU is kind of like the federal government of the United States. And I think the only addition to that, or the primary addition to that, is that there are hundreds of years of cultural development in those countries versus 200,
Significantly less.
200 years approximately in the U.S., depending on the state. Some of that's like 150 years, so it's significantly shorter. But also the language barrier. And I think that's the biggest one, that it can be very, very difficult to break down those language barriers.
Right. And language is a big deal. But even within the U.S., there are some areas where you may not actually be able to speak English to the folks in the area. A great example would be in some places in southern Texas, close to Mexico, where you may hear more Spanish than English.
And it's not just in Texas. It's really anywhere along the Mexican border. You would be reasonably expected to need to understand Spanish to communicate with a lot of individuals.
Right.
And again, that has to do partially with the heritage of those states. There has been a lot of Mexican and Spanish involvement during the colonization of that region. So it makes sense that part of their heritage is to have Spanish and Mexican culture mixed in with it, which, by the way, can be a great thing. That's how we get Tex-Mex.
Yeah, like everybody loves that.
Right. So I think that mixing of cultures isn't necessarily bad. I think that it is what allows us to be exposed to new ideas that we wouldn't previously have been exposed to. And that kind of brings up the idea of how secure should borders be? And yes, we will be talking about things like securing the U.S.-Mexico border, but we'll get to that in a little bit. How secure should borders be?
I think part of that goes back to that trust that we were talking about earlier, where if we're thinking about this on, say, a country level, if I trust the country I'm next to, I may be more willing to just let their people in without really caring as much.
The EU is probably a good example of that for now, because
Right.
free travel between the countries is something that's established.
Exactly.
And the United States as well. Going between states, you may have a toll, particularly in Illinois, Indiana, they have some toll roads, but for the most part, I'm in a new state? Okay. You probably wouldn't even know.
Yeah, it's not a big deal.
Right. But as we go towards countries where the laws can differ significantly, how should those borders be enforced?
Right. And like I said, that does kind of go into the trust somewhat. Because if you have two countries that trust each other a fair bit, they are similar in economic status. I think that's a big deal in a lot of cases, so that you don't have people from one country who is poorer trying to go to the richer country. You can have a more open border. Between the U.S. and Canada is a lot more open than between Mexico and the U.S.
And I think that comes down to the degree of difference between the cultures. Now, like we mentioned, there is a decent amount of overlap in the southern border in the sense that while the primary language of the United States is English, in the southern part of the United States, there's a lot more Spanish-speaking individuals because of the cultural flow. So that border is a little less defined because there's a lot of cultural overlap. The flip side of that, I think a lot of people would argue that that's because people are running away from Mexico, quite literally running away from Mexico into the United States. I believe at the time of this recording, it's something like 10% of the Mexican population lives in the United States. And I mean that as in they are Mexican citizens that have not gone through the immigration process. They just decided to come across the border and live in the United States. So, sorry for the sound. A cat hopped up on the table. Where was I? I got distracted. 10%?
Yep.
Yeah, so 10% of Mexico lives in the United States. And that's because they didn't follow the legal immigration, which means that they are still technically Mexican citizens, and they are bringing that culture over. To what degree that's bad, we can have that discussion, but that makes the border discussion fuzzier when it comes to the America-Mexico border.
Right. We don't have as many Canadian citizens coming over and living in the United States for extended periods of time without going through immigration.
Right, and that's because it hasn't really become problematic with people hopping the border between the U.S. and Canada.
Right.
So the Mexico-U.S. border problem. Is it a problem? The fact that Mexicans are, and I'm going to use the term flocking here because I think it's accurate. It's, again, at the time of recording, something like in the last month, 100,000 people have come over from Mexico to the U.S. undocumented.
Right. Not all of them are Mexicans. I know a lot of them are coming from other Central American countries as well. But there's still a lot coming over the Mexico border.
But I would contend that individuals from Mexico, Honduras, Panama probably have more in common with each other than they do with people in the middle or even southern United States.
I could definitely see that. They're more likely to be speaking a common language. They have a much closer heritage. You know, if we're thinking about somebody in Mexico in comparison to someone in Oklahoma, you know, that's not terribly much further than Texas, but that's still quite a gap.
Well, and let's take a larger distance. The distance between Mexico and Brazil is probably comparable to the difference between Mexico and Montana. If you took someone from the middle of Mexico and stuck them in Montana, I think they would be a lot less comfortable than if you stuck them in Brazil.
Right, because they're not going to know the language. It's going to be a very different culture. There's going to be so much culture shock if they went to Montana.
Right, and Central and South America, I think, tend to be very, very, very similar in terms of culture, language, and then when you get to the United States, that drastically changes. So, for instance, in South America, there are still dictatorships and communist countries and more socialist countries than the United States is. So there are significant differences there that many would argue are somewhat incompatible, at least not directly. And I think that that's where people who are on the right are arguing we can't just accept these people blindly because not because they were born in another country, but because they're bringing a different culture that is not necessarily compatible. So to what degree is a country able to maintain its culture, and at what point does that become poisonous?
I think that's a really important thing to dig into, because even within the United States, we do have these enclaves of people who have their own culture. You can think of things like a Chinatown, where they are very much China.
Yep.
They still speak English in many cases, but they have their own enclave of people who are very similar to them, and they have their own culture. And I think having small enclaves like that isn't a big deal, especially if they are willing to talk to the rest of society.
And I'm going to disagree with you there.
Okay.
In the first part. And my father is an example of that. My father is an immigrant. He came over from Europe when he was, I think, 10 years old or something, legally. And he and his parents had the option to say, all right, are we going to live in a group of people that speak our language and share our culture from where we came from, or are we going to integrate? And they chose to take the harder route of integrating. He learned English. It was not his native language. He knew 2 other languages before that, which were his native languages, and he learned English when he came over here because they wanted to integrate with the culture. And that doesn't mean that he forgot about his culture. He's still, he's been speaking English for 40, 50 years now, and that's his first language. But he can still speak the languages that he grew up with. He still appreciates his culture. He's still gone back to that country and remembers it fondly. But he has integrated himself with the culture because he wanted to. His family viewed the American culture as better to their own. In particular, the reason that they left was because it was a communist country and things were falling apart very quickly, and they wanted to get out. And so they came over to the United States, and they had the decision of, do we want to bring the culture that we're running away from, or do we want to integrate ourselves with that new culture while still preserving the good parts of our culture?
And that's a really good point, because it can be very difficult to integrate in a very different culture.
It is, especially when you don't know the language.
Right. But one thing that some cultures have shown to be successful, I forgot exactly which country it was, but what it was in the United States, they had a group of people who were pretty set up. And when people would immigrate from their old country to the United States, they would teach the women how to own nail salons. They would teach them how to do manicures, pedicures, the business side of things. And then they would set them out to some other area of the country where they could start their own nail salon. So they could be so much more successful because they started out with people like them. They had a place that could support them while learning the language and learning about being in the United States, and also learning some skills that could help them along the way.
Sure, and having a transitional period of people that also want to preserve their culture, but also help you integrate with the new culture.
Right, and I think that thought of integrating with the new culture is really important. I know that there are a lot of cases in the United States where those small groups of people would essentially wall themselves off from the rest, and that doesn't really work in the grand scheme of things.
And like how you had said, having enclaves, the idea of a Chinatown, the idea of, I know in quite a few first world countries right now with refugees from Muslim countries, they tend to set themselves up in mostly Islamic communities because those are individuals that share their religious beliefs and cultural beliefs, look similar, speak the same language. In New Zealand, surprisingly, is a good example of this. There are no-go zones because there is such a dense population of Muslim individuals that they start following different laws than the parent country.
I think that starts becoming a problem real fast.
Especially when the laws that those groups are following directly break the laws of the parent country. And it, like I said, it's literally to the point where police will instruct tourists or other citizens, hey, don't go there because we aren't going to be going in to help you out. It's a no-go zone. Whether they call it that or not, they are places where the police will not go and they tell you not to go to. And I've seen videos of journalists trying to go there and police trying to stop them, even though it's a public area. It's not sectioned off. There's no official border. They say, you can't go there because the culture is so confined and different there that you effectively follow different laws. And I think that this is one of the reasons that people are hesitant to just accept all refugees or accept all immigrants without limitation. And a lot of people will label that as xenophobic. And while, yes, there are some individuals that's the case, I think for the majority of rational people, the worry is if people are flooding in a culture that I'm not familiar with, that is a potential danger, and I'm not comfortable with it. It goes back to how we started the conversation of someone is penetrating my personal space, and I don't know about them. That makes me uncomfortable. And I think that for people who say, well, they're refugees, we need to be good to them. We need to be nice to them regardless of their situation, regardless of who they are or where they're coming from. If you imagine instead someone telling you, here's this person, you don't know anything about them, I'm going to set them right next to you or on top of you. Like they don't have another seat, so they're going to sit on top of you. I think there are very few people in the world that would be okay with a random stranger sitting on their lap. And for the people who are yelling, oh, you're just xenophobic, I want you to imagine that people who are afraid of that or afraid of immigrants and refugees coming to their country, they are afraid of the unknown. And I think that there's nothing unreasonable about that.
Yeah, especially at the rates that people are flooding into some of these countries.
Which it's in the hundreds of thousands or millions in some cases. And that's a significant portion of your country. So I think that the fear that some people feel of refugees being a form of an invasion, I think has some legitimacy to it. So again, with the example of the no-go zones, a zone where you can't go into because they follow different laws, that's a border. And it's not an officially recognized border, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a border.
Yep.
And if you are going to another country and you set up your own country there with borders, that's an invasion. By definition, do you disagree with that?
You're definitely right there.
So if people come over and set up their own enclaves that don't directly follow the laws of the parent country, are they immigrating to that country or invading it? Now the conversation's getting interesting.
Yep. Because if they're not willing to integrate with the rest of society, then they're not really immigrating too much. They're bringing all of their baggage with them.
And I think that that's the key point of this, is if you come to another country and set yourself up with other individuals like yourself, don't integrate with that new country, you are bringing with you all of the values that you ran away from or that you left behind. You are immigrating for a reason. Most of the time it's because you're looking for better opportunities. If you move to a new location looking for better opportunities and you bring with you all of the things that you left behind, eventually those opportunities will disappear. Because, and let's take the extreme example. If you're in a third world country and you come to a first world country and you try to only live in a place that is still the same culture of that third world country, and then you briefly go over, work in the first world country, and then come back to that enclave, what have you accomplished?
You didn't really get much. Maybe some more money, but even then, if you were coming from a third world country, your level of education is going to be drastically different than most of the people in the first world country. So you're probably not going to get those high-paying jobs that you want.
And even if you do, you're still, in the extreme enclave example, you're still subjected to the same laws as your old country, which is what you were trying to get away from. And again, I think that this is one of the legitimate concerns that people on the political right have a reasonable argument that if you move people from a third world country into a first world country and they are not willing to let go of some of those tendencies and those political beliefs, the problems from those third world countries are going to come into the first world countries. And on a similar note, I'm going to take a little detour here. There's an idea that you can improve people by exposing them to better people. And particularly in kids. You know, if you have a bad kid in the class, well, you put them with the good kids. Studies have been done on the effects of that. If you take a bad kid and just stick them in a class with good kids, the good kids get worse. Because they have a negative influence around. Generally speaking, it's, oh, why work hard? You can just be lazy. And point to an easier route that ends up being more destructive. So the idea of exposing bad people to good people automatically fixes them, at least in the research that has been done so far, that has been shown to not be true. That people are much more easily swayed to go towards I don't want to say evil, but towards what we would stereotypically refer to as bad. So I think that the critical point of immigration is when you move to a new country, it's because you are leaving behind the negatives that you see in your current place of residence, in your current country, and the only way of actually integrating yourself with that society is to let go of a lot of those preconceptions that you have, accept that you no longer follow the laws of that old country, and integrate yourself as in, and when I say integrate, I don't mean force your culture on the new country. I mean, take the culture of the new country and change yourself to be like that. I think that's what it means to immigrate.
I can definitely see that. But if we're to prevent more people from joining these enclaves and not integrating with society, what are we going to do about that? Do we need to go break up all these existing enclaves of people?
This is the idea of deportation. That we have these enclaves. They're not following our laws. They should not benefit from the people who are following our laws. And should we just deport them back to the country? If you are here, but you're living as if you were in your own country, we should just send you back to your own country.
Even if they were here legally?
And that's where the argument breaks down because, well, they followed the laws to get here. Are they still following the laws? So if you immigrate over and then break the laws, should deportation be an option?
And I think that's tricky because it kind of also depends on what laws are they breaking.
Are they violent laws? Are they minor laws? Oh, did your license expire because you forgot to send in a renewal on time or something?
Right. I'm going to be much more lenient over a license renewal than murder.
Sure. What if there's a no-go zone that you can't even verify because cops don't go there? Or, for instance, just high crime areas. Should those people be treated differently? If you have a legal immigrant and a natural-born citizen, should they be treated differently for committing the same crime?
I mean, in general, I would expect their punishment to be the same. But part of the problem is the one who's here illegally is probably going to be deported, as opposed to the one who is here legally would go to jail.
And I think that it seems reasonable to argue that if a person comes over illegally, that particularly, and again, we're sticking particularly to the United States and Mexico situation. In the United States, there are laws related to immigration. If someone comes over illegally, regardless of the reason why, the fact that they came over illegally sends a message to that new country, in this case, the United States, I am ignoring this law. The first thing that person did coming to this country was ignore a law. And I think that that is enough to say, I don't respect the culture.
But what if there really isn't a good way to follow the law? A lot of immigration courts are really backed up. If you want to come to the United States, they do limit the number of people per country.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're coming over from Mexico, there's a lot of people that you're vying with for those spots.
And there's not enough. There is more want than there is legal capability to handle that and move people over.
Right.
So should we just say everyone can come? Open border.
As much as I'd love that, I think logistically that's never going to work.
And I'm going to take another argument ad absurdum. You are female. There are lots of males around. One of their wants is to have sex. Should you just say, my borders are open, you all want, have at it?
Yeah, that's not going to fly.
Because you have a border set up around, and regardless of whether or not the other individuals want something that you have the capability to grant, technically speaking, there are 10 guys that want to have sex. They could all have sex with you in a day. It wouldn't be pleasant for you. It would be a burden on you, and it would be breaching your borders, but it would benefit 10 people. You could do it. So that sort of open sexual borders, many would view the U.S.-Mexico border as, well, they all want to do it. Should we just let them all in? And I can hear people right now just being super, super upset that I'm equating Mexican illegal immigration to rape. But conceptually, it's very similar. We've said, don't cross this. We're not okay with you crossing this unless we give you permission. And that's ignored. And
right. I think part of the problem is it's really hard to give that permission right now. If the process was maybe faster to say, no, you can't come over, you need to stay in Mexico, or yes, you can come over, would that change anything?
And following the analogy, the idea of sexual promiscuity. Is it okay to be very sexually open, or is there a benefit to being monogamous or being very selective in your sexual partners? Is there a benefit to being selective in the individuals that you permit to immigrate to your country?
I think absolutely, because we want all the smart people. We only have enough room for a certain number of gardeners, for example, if they're just your typical gardener for suburban folks, handling the flowers, mowing the lawn. There's only so many of people of that skill level we need. But like doctors or engineers, I'd be more open to taking more of those.
But now we get into a different problem, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Have you heard of the concept of brain drain?
Yes, I'm glad we're going this direction.
Okay, so for those of you that are not familiar with what brain drain is, brain drain is the term given to the idea that smart people in stereotypically bad countries or third world countries where they can't really put their intelligence to as good of use as they'd like, they want to earn more money, they want to actually apply their knowledge, leave that country and go somewhere else, particularly to a first world country where they can apply their knowledge to a higher degree. That's brain drain, because the best brains leave. That is bad for the country that they're leaving, because they're a third world country, where we refer to them as third world countries because they have lower living conditions. How do you improve those living conditions? Well, you have smart people that help make living conditions better. And if those smart people leave, those conditions get worse. So I would argue that allowing unrestricted flow of people away from third world countries or countries where there's a lower quality of life makes those countries worse, which makes more people want to leave them, and then that just floods everyone into the first world. Is that bad?
I mean, we can't support everybody in the first world. If all the people from, say, the impoverished African countries try to go to Europe, that doesn't really work.
Particularly in the sense that Europe is already relatively population dense, and Africa has a very large number of people, so if you just transport them all magically over to Europe, even ignoring the transportation logistics, everyone is just magically there. Holy cow, that would be a nightmare because the overpopulation would be awful.
Right. Not to mention all the cultural and language barriers on top of that.
Yeah, people don't speak the same language, and even if you set up enclaves, that again has the problem of now you have people who have very different cultures living right next to each other that are frequently incompatible in the sense that they believe very different things. I was just reading an article on some African cultures that believe that albinos have magical healing properties, as in they will take albino individuals, kill them, and use their body parts for witchcraft rituals. And I realize that that's an extreme example, but I guess a less extreme example, cultures that will kill rhinos and use the rhino horns, grind them into a powder, and sell them with the excuse of they cure cancer. Those types of ideas are, I would argue, not very compatible with people living in the first world. And when you transport a large number of those people into that first world, it decreases the quality of life there. So I guess a better way of phrasing the question is, we could take some people from the third world, bring them into the first world, and live less luxurious lives, have smaller houses, but increase the quality of living of people from the third world. We could do that. I think the question then becomes, to what degree should we do that?
Right. Because especially if you want to prevent brain drain from these third world countries, you would be more likely to be bringing over the impoverished people, or the people who just didn't get a lot of education. They don't have a lot of means in many cases. And when they come over to this new country, are they really going to be any better if they don't have the skills to get a job in this new country?
And I think that's the better question is, what would they do here?
Right. Because we only have so much room for lawn care workers, waitresses, cooks.
Well, and as automation continues to become much more prevalent in the first world, low skill labor is an increasingly small market. So third world, or individuals coming from the third world are becoming less and less useful in the first world. So the idea of, as we become more resource abundant, socialism starts cropping up more and more. But if you take individuals from all across the world and put them into the countries that have a resource abundance, that resource abundance goes away immediately. And to bring up a specific example around the time of this recording, In the United States, the Democratic debate was held, and one of the questions that was asked was, would you provide government health care for illegal immigrants? And every single hand went up. I personally find that very concerning because the United States doesn't provide health care to its own citizens for free. So how would we expect to provide it for our own and for other countries? And we talked about this in the earlier episode with healthcare, the idea of how can you provide for everyone, and not just everyone, but everyone in the world. And it very quickly becomes unreasonable. And I think that what people are arguing against when they're arguing for controlled immigration is the idea that we take care of our own first, and then we help others. Is that xenophobic?
I don't think so. Because after all, do I want to help you or some random African child on the other side of the world? If we think about it in that regard, I would much rather help you. I know you, and I'm a good friend of yours, you know? So I'd much rather devote my resources to helping you than somebody I don't know, and frankly, I don't know if they would use my resources as well.
Arguably, though, you could take the same resources and improve the quality of that other person's life much more than improving the quality of my life.
That's true. But improving just that one person's quality of life isn't really going to help them when the rest of their community is still in a bad place.
So I guess what it falls down to, and again, with the idea of brain drain, whose responsibility is it to improve the lives of individuals in third world countries? Or in any country that is a lower quality of life than the country other individuals are currently living in? Whose responsibility is it?
I think we're going to have to fall back on that third world country. They have to want to make themselves better and educate their people to do it. Now, if educating their people to do it means sending them to some other country for schooling, okay.
For instance, I think China does that. People will come over from China to the United States, get educated, and then go back to China.
Right. It's also really common in Middle Eastern countries. In my engineering school, there were a lot of people who were sponsored by Saudi Aramco for petroleum engineering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But taking that knowledge back to their country, they can make their country better. But unfortunately, a lot of these, for example, the impoverished African nations, they can't really afford to send somebody.
Yeah, it can be really, really expensive to fly over to the United States and then go to a United States college. Although if you manage to get loans and then just never pay them back, the problem goes away, but then that becomes a drain on the country that you're going to.
Right, and even then, you'd still need a fair bit of education first, because you'd need to know English to take these classes.
Or at least to get a reasonable amount of information out of them. Yes.
Right, which you probably don't know in the first place. And it's going to be a massive culture shock.
So let's go away from the idea of controlled improvement and look at refugees. And I mean legitimate refugees. I'm not talking about economic immigrants or economic refugees, whatever you want to call them. People who come from poor countries that want to go to a richer country to be able to work, put their lives to good use. I think that those are the individuals that the countries that they're leaving need the most. But let's look at a country that is war-torn and legitimately has refugees. Should they go to other countries? Should other countries accept those war refugees into their borders?
I think they have to. You know, if your country is war-torn, I'm thinking of somewhere like Syria, where it's not really safe to live there. In those cases, I mean, we want people to live, so we're going to have to accept their refugees.
Oh boy. All right. At the risk of sounding very controversial, your statement. We want those people to live. Do we?
I mean, I definitely think that depends on who you talk to, but in general, I would like them to live. I don't like the idea of people being killed at all, really.
Who's responsible for stopping the killing?
Honestly, as we mentioned before, with the third world country building itself up, it's going to have to be that country stopping the war.
And I think the problem is, if you have a war going on and people run away, they are running away from the problem, and they are people that obviously disagree with how the problem is being solved or the thing that's causing the problem, and by running away from it, you perpetuate or avoid solving the problem. The only way to solve the problem is to fight it out. If it gets to the point where war is the solution that's being pursued, in almost all cases that's involuntary, but war breaks out because people are no longer communicating and discussing with each other. If people run away from that, which is perfectly reasonable because you don't want to die, but if you run away from that, you don't solve the problem. The war will continue, people will die, and the good people that ran away will live on more, but now their home country is completely destroyed, and the side that they would have hoped to win may not have won.
So how should those people help? Do they just fight in the war too?
That is an option of, you are there. If you want to preserve your culture, if you want to preserve your homeland, if you want to solve the problem, fight.
But what if I don't really want to save my homeland after seeing this war? You know, in Syria, a lot of places, it's just rubble nowadays. Mm-hmm. Do I really want to be in a place like that?
In which case, if you are going to move to another country, adopt that culture. You are running away from a culture that ended in war. Obviously, something went wrong, which means that the preconceptions that you carry with you of how places should be governed or how people should be governed, and the war was led to by culture. So when you run away from an area because of war, think of it as, my culture somehow led to it. I should adopt the culture of the area that I'm moving to, because they're obviously not at war. So they obviously know something that I would argue is better than the country that I'm running away from, because the country that I'm running away from, everyone's killing each other. This country, they're not all killing each other. They must be doing something right. I should probably start behaving in the way that they are. And I think that if people are willing to adopt that, then there's nothing wrong with taking in refugees. But it's, again, comes back to whether or not it's war, economic migrants, or you just feel like going to a different country. If you are willing to adopt the culture of the area that you're moving to, I think there's nothing wrong with immigration. Still bringing with some of the traditions and culture of your old country, but accept that you need to primarily take on the culture of the area that you're moving to. That's how to successfully have migration across borders, which, again, borders are nothing more than an established line between cultures.
I think that makes sense. And one thing we were talking about earlier was the brain drain of these poor countries losing their top performers to somewhere else. But what if this somewhere else really needs those people? You know, in the United States, for example, there is a shortage of primary care doctors, but a lot of doctors who are immigrating from India are more than happy to be the primary care doctors that we need.
But we don't need them nearly as much as that country.
So we should leave them there, even though we could use them ourselves to better our own population?
So you're taking the, to quote from a movie, a chief protects his own. You're throwing that back in me, aren't you? If we want to do what helps the most people, we should attempt to improve quality of life in as many places as possible. And yes, we should try to improve quality of life here. But if someone has the ability, is already living in another country, and has the ability to improve the quality of life in that country, and all we have to do is say, no, we don't want you. It's not that we don't want you. It's that we think you could do better for more people where you are.
But is that really going to stop them from looking somewhere else? That would need to be more of a worldwide policy to really help anybody. And
it would have to be a worldwide policy that everyone agrees to, which again has across different cultures, not everyone will agree to that. So it's a problem with enforcement of that idea. So how do we, I guess the question is, how do we deal with the problem of brain drain?
Right, and it's tricky because we do want to keep those people in those countries.
But we also want to accept them. We want to benefit from them, but we also want their country to benefit from them.
Right. So a very simple way, at least in theory, would almost be like a quota. Say we are only going to allow this many people, which is exactly what the United States does with who can come from what countries.
But then if you run out of that quota, then you run into the problem of everyone wanting to flood over and, well, why is there a quota? Just let me in.
Right. Granted, at least in the United States, it's more of a problem with the countries that we actually border.
Yep.
Rather than...
That's actually not as true anymore.
Really?
There are people that will fly from Africa to Mexico and then cross the Mexico-U.S. border.
It's a very interesting way to get here. But I definitely don't blame them, considering what they would be coming from in Africa.
Right. But my argument is that it is unethical for someone that has the capability of improving the life of the country that they live in to run away to pursue better options in another country that is not necessarily compatible with their beliefs, or at least if they aren't looking to integrate. But even if they are looking to integrate, there is an argument to be made that it's unethical to leave your home country when you could improve it.
Yeah, just preventing...
Because you have a moral responsibility. If people want to make moral arguments about borders, and enforcing borders is immoral, which I hear from some government officials, that it's immoral to enforce borders. By the same token, it's immoral to leave the individuals that you are most close with, to leave your family for self-benefit. If you want to do the most good, stay in the country that you live in and improve it. Especially when you are the one that sees the problems. There's a reason you're leaving. It's because you see problems. Fix the problems.
So should countries be building walls to keep people in?
I'm glad you brought that up. That's one of the things I wanted to talk about. It's the opposite side of the same coin. The idea that we've been up until this point talking about keeping people out. What about keeping people in? I would argue that keeping people in by force is just as problematic, if not more so.
And why would you say that?
Communism. Under almost all systems of governments, whether that be kingships or monarchies, democracy, almost any form of government, walls have been built or borders have been set up to keep people out. We have a good life. We want to protect that from people who wish to take it away from us. Communism and actual socialism, or full-on socialism, are some of the only examples where a border is built to keep people in. If you want direct examples, East Germany, when it was governed by Soviet Russia, North Korea. North Korea is a perfect example in the modern day because, for instance, in the Olympics, North Korean athletes were allowed to partake in the Olympics. They also were always accompanied by a security officer that made sure they had limited access to phone and would always be with them to make sure that they didn't just run away and not go back to the country. They actually sent people with their athletes to make sure that they would be dragged back to the country.
It says a lot about your country if you have to do that.
Yeah. If they know that people want to run away so badly, it's a problem. But there's an argument for it, particularly in communist societies or socialist societies. If you benefit from our country and then you leave, that entire country misses out on your benefit. That humans in communist and socialist societies are a resource to be managed. And if you leave, you are losing resources. So you have every imperative for the sake of the society and the sake of the whole, the good of the many outweighing the good of the few, to prevent those few people from leaving.
That's very similar to what you were talking about with the brain drain, just not from the government, from your own moral standings.
Right. And so the idea of a country self-enforcing a limitation on brain drain is arguably equivalent to slavery, because you're preventing them from leaving and you're forcing them to stay and work. So we don't want brain drain because we want to help out those countries, and the people best suited to help out those countries are the people who are smart and grew up in that country because they know the ins and outs of the culture, they know the people, and they know how to best connect with those people, but forcing them to do it is just slavery.
But is there any other way to make them stay?
Should we rely on other countries to say, no, we're not allowing you to come here?
But not every country is going to agree to that.
Sure. In which case, those countries will accept in the people. They will take on whatever burdens or benefits are associated with the individuals coming in. I think it will have a negative effect on the country with the lower quality of life. I think that because that person is coming from a lower quality of life and going into a country with a higher quality of life, the average quality of life in that higher quality of life country will go down. And
but
so,
is it down enough for anybody to notice in many cases? If
when
you're
you have
limiting,
100,000 people a month coming over, yes.
But if you're limiting that, then it's not as big of a deal.
And at some point, countries will limit it. And I think in the U.S., we see attempts being made to do that limitation. So you limit it. Other countries limit the migration of both smart and, I don't want to say dumb, but educated and uneducated individuals from lower quality of life countries. So they say, no, stay there. They're free to do whatever they want in any other place that they can go to, but I think that the declination of immigration should come from the receiving country and not from the target country, because of the reasons that I brought up earlier, that if it's the target, if it's the sending country, the country that you're coming from, the origination country, and you're preventing people from leaving, that is enforced slavery.
But what if the sending country put incentives in place to keep people around? Be like, oh, I see you're considering going to the United States. What if we give you more money to keep you around? Is that something you could agree with?
One of the reasons that people are running away from those countries is because they have no money.
Exactly.
So what reason do people have to stay?
I mean, part of that is the community. In some cases, these people are running away from their families and friends that they've known forever.
Not running away from, but leaving a lot of times in hopes of helping them. But yeah, they are running away from the problems of where they live.
Right. And if, say, in the case of money, if the government was in such a place where they could give people money to stay and make their life even a little bit better, could that be enough to stop people from immigrating? And keep the smart people in that country to make it better?
I don't think it's a question that can be asked, because we're thinking of practical solutions to a moral problem. The moral problem being that there will always be a difference in the quality of life between peoples. And a lot of times those are culturally created. So, as an example, Western nations have drastically improved technologically and in quality of life over the past 300 years. Countries in Africa, the Middle East, Asia have largely stagnated, or at least the benefits that they have gained largely come from Western nations. It's because of a difference in culture. So, to what degree should the benefits of Western nations go to non-Western nations? Is it our obligation as individuals of a Western society to improve the lives of others? If it is, then we should not have any higher quality of life. We should do as much as possible to help those other individuals. That should be enforced by the government, because otherwise not everyone will want to do it. Should it be voluntary? Should it be forced? To what degree do we help out other nations?
Well, I think if we force it, nobody's going to be happy.
And people will then start leaving the countries that are doing that forcing to look for better opportunities in other countries. So we have brain drain from the good countries to the countries to make other areas better. So I think if you force, then you just spread the problem of the third world further up.
Yeah.
So you can't force it, which means it has to be voluntary. And I think that what it comes down to is when people do things voluntarily, and the charity that's given from the first world to the third world is the degree to which the culture is willing to help out other individuals. That is the collective intelligence. That is the decision made by the collective intelligence of the culture that has to the culture that has not. And anything beyond that is immoral. Because if you force people, that is immoral to the individuals that you're taking from. And if you do less, well, that's arguably also immoral. But I think the best middle ground that we can come to is let people decide. And we, in a lot of Western nations, we do go out and help. For instance, Doctors Without Borders.
Engineers Without Borders is another one.
Yeah, and we help other people. Could we do more? Yes. But if we're forced to do more, people will end up doing less. And I think that the fact that if people are forced to do things, they will do less, means that giving people the freedom to decide provides the optimal solution to improving the quality of life of other countries. And again, coming back to the people living in those countries, if they are excluded from moving to another country by that receiving country, they're free to go anywhere else that will accept them. But I think that decision needs to be made collectively. It can't be enforced from the country that the people are trying to leave. It has to be enforced by the country that's receiving. In the case of America and Mexico, that means that Mexico should not keep its citizens prisoner. The U.S. should say no. Or we will accept these people. We have voted on this. We've determined this. Here are the people that we will accept. Here's the number of people that we will accept. Everyone else will be sent back. Do with that what you will. If you want to keep spending the rest of your life trying to come over here, fine. But we will keep sending you back until you finally realize that it is your responsibility to improve the lives of the people in your country.
And I think that makes sense. At least with the U.S.-Mexico border, though, one of the problems there is there are a lot of people that have found relatively easy ways to come into the United States illegally. To what extent should we be protecting that border to prevent these people from coming in?
So in other words, should we have guards stationed with guns, and if anyone tries to cross the border, shoot them?
That's definitely an option.
It would also stop the flood of people that are trying to come over.
Yeah. A lot of people wouldn't like it.
This is... But it could be a reasonable thing to do, of have the threat of death from trying to forcibly enter another country. Right.
It'll certainly help prevent the brain drain from Mexico, because if you're smart, you wouldn't try to cross the border illegally, and the legal process takes a lot of time.
And ideally, if you, let's say, kill 10 people, and it is known that if you try to cross this border, there's a decent chance that someone will shoot you. It shouldn't be an ongoing thing where people will continue trying to come over. Once they realize lethal force is going to be used, ideally, there would be far fewer attempts and far fewer deaths. So it would limit the number of people that die, including people are already dying trying to cross the border. If you add on the idea that we will enforce the border, not just through nature, but we will kill you, it would decrease the likelihood of people wanting to risk it. So you could save lives doing that so that people don't end up just dying, drowning in rivers or starving in the desert. You could save lives doing that. And by the way, if any of these arguments seem reasonable to you, be very careful because, again,
these things have been tried before.
These things have been tried before, but more importantly, there's an idea of the line between good and evil runs through every man's heart. And I'll bring this up. If you haven't read it, really good book out there is Ordinary Men. The idea of how ordinary, logical individuals became, in Nazi Germany, specifically in Poland after it was invaded, went and killed thousands of people. Polish policemen that ended up massacring thousands of Jews. Every person in the world is capable of doing that, including the people that want open borders. You need to accept to yourself that everyone is capable of doing that, because there's some argument that could be made to justify killing or any action under some circumstances. And particularly with border protection, well, if you can kill one person to save 100 people, that seems reasonable. If you're trying to protect the border, if people are flooding across the border and dying for whatever reason, well, adding on an extra lethality to it, well, that could be a good idea. Be very careful with that type of argument, because it can devolve very quickly. At the same time, maybe it's a good thing, because definitively saying no, and we will send you back. And by the way, when someone is arrested, to a degree, it's at the point of a gun. Even if the gun is holstered,
it's always an option.
The threat is there. So, is it used often? No. If you put it on the border, would it be used often? No. Well, what if we started expanding the border? Well, we're not using that, and we're trying to expand the border to help them out. And that's where you end up becoming a military invasion force. So there can definitely be a slippery slope here, but to enforcing the border through lethal means. But in the end, arresting and deportation has the threat of lethality to it. But again, it comes back to the idea that I think the protection should come from the receiving country, because it's up to them on whether or not they want to accept you. And if not, it's still up to you to decide. The person that wants to move still has the decision to make. Do I want to risk going illegally? Do I want to move to a different country that is more accepting? Or do I want to actually improve directly the quality of life in the country that I'm living in?
Exactly.
Is it, and I guess the question that most people should be asking is it moral to decline someone from wanting to come live with you if it means that that person is more likely to help the individuals that need the most help?
It makes sense, because if that one person goes out and helps even 5 people, that's worth it.
So I'm going to bring up a specific example, and I think a lot of times we haven't been doing this, but Trump's border wall. The idea is not to make an impenetrable wall across the entire border. The idea is make the wall large enough that the threat of dying out in nature is greater than the threat of being caught in the port of entry. So it's intended to funnel people into the port of entry where we can actually manage them, check, and see what's going on with the people that are coming in. Are you smuggling people? Are you trafficking individuals? Are you bringing in drugs? Do we know about you? Do we have any information on you? That's the idea behind the wall. Being able to make those decisions consciously and being able to prevent people from just flooding away from the regions in Mexico that could most use physically capable individuals, capables that are, say, capable of walking across the desert for long periods of time. Those people who are physically able to do hard work would be able to benefit Mexico, the country that they're coming from. There's an argument to be made that making that border wall would make it more difficult for those individuals to come to the United States, which means they would be able to benefit Mexico more and be able to help more individuals, rather than coming over, standing on the side of the road, waiting for a truck to drive by and saying, hey, I need 5 guys to paint a house, which is a lot of times what ends up happening, which means that they're undocumented, they don't have health care, they don't have a lot of worker protections, a lot of times can be underpaid, work in unsafe conditions, no certainty in having having employment. I realize that a lot of that they won't get in their home country, but at least in their home country, the people that will be benefiting from their work are themselves and other individuals like them and other individuals in that country. You'll increase the quality of life in that country rather than just be painting some dude's house.
Yep. And with a wall, if you came up to this very tall wall, that's very intimidating.
And a lot of times if you want to bring over your family, you may be able to get over a 20-foot wall. Maybe your wife or your child can't. And you may not want to risk your 10-year-old child's life by crawling over a 20-foot wall and risking them falling.
Right.
Or traveling 100 miles out into the desert. So, do you think that, given that, Trump's border wall is a good and ethical idea?
I think it would work.
And by the way, I'm asking this because I know how you feel about Trump.
Right. Right. For the folks listening, I am not a fan of Trump. But this is one case where it actually somewhat makes sense.
I'm shocked.
I know. The one thing I would worry about, though, is those ports of entry getting so many people that they can't manage, because it's already pretty hard for them to manage.
Oh, yeah. There's tend to be a long line of cars, generally from Mexico going to the U.S.
Right. And I would be worried about it getting significantly worse with the wall and them just not having the manpower to deal with it. And that could lead to, potentially, a bunch of people just storming the port of entry.
Which we've already had, by the way. For instance, with the caravan from Honduras, they just stormed the wall. It wasn't very successful, but people can try it. But the idea of make it difficult enough that it is more worth putting your effort and time towards working on improving the country that you're in rather than trying to get to the new country.
Right.
And I think that while the rhetoric isn't directly stating that, that's the idea behind it. Stay in your country, benefit the people that are around you, and the only way to do that without threat of lethal force and directly just putting guns on the border is to build a wall that is difficult enough to get around or over, that people go to the port of entry and make the port of entry go through a legal process to still allow people to travel, but for individuals that want to get over here illegally, make it next to impossible enough that people will put their efforts towards a better cause. And again, with the idea of, well, how do you deal with brain drain? How do you deal with low-skilled workers coming to an area where low-skilled work is not in demand? You're not helping the country you're leaving. You're not helping the country that you're going to. The best thing to do is for the receiving country to just say no, enforce that through non-lethal means. And honestly, I think building a large wall while still having a port of entry is a pretty reasonable way to do it.
Yeah, there's certainly worse ways to do it.
Are there? Now, again, as someone who historically has not liked Trump, and probably maybe before today has not liked the idea of a border wall, I'm curious, what were your previous thoughts before we had this conversation?
Was not a big fan of it at all, just more logistically.
Because it costs money.
Right. Money that we don't necessarily have, and already, ICE and border enforcement folks don't have enough money to do what they're supposed to be doing.
But arguably, it's more expensive to catch people once they're here and deport them and house them and make sure that they have reasonable living conditions. That is more difficult than just building the wall.
That is true, because it's a logistical nightmare to get enough food, beds.
Right. I believe that the cost of handling illegal immigration the way it's currently done in the United States, particularly referring to the Mexican border, is on the order of $100 to $120 million per year. No, sorry, billion. $100 to $120 billion per year. And that includes strain on healthcare institutions, so emergency rooms, providing healthcare to people, because a lot of times if they're coming across the desert, they are probably not in very good condition, and ERs are legally obligated to help you to the point of no longer being in critical condition and then letting you go. The hospital is just going to be out that money. And also just ICE handling the deportation. So building a wall, I believe Trump was originally asking $20 billion.
It's in the ballpark.
So that's a fifth of the total cost of illegal immigration per year to help make it more manageable. If it could cut down on 20% of the illegal immigration that's coming over, it pays for itself in a year.
Yeah. And chances are it would cut it down a bit more than that just because it's so much harder to get across.
And that's the idea. So that people would view braving the wall as more risky than just trying to do things legally. That would also avoid these situations of, this father and daughter and son or whatever died in a river because they drowned. Make it too difficult to cross the border illegally so that you can handle things in a controlled way. And being able to manage it is going to be a lot better than just having uncontrolled migration.
And it also cuts down on a lot of things that we don't like seeing in the U.S., like the shelters for the children of immigrants right now that are not great.
And part of the reason they're not great is because there's a huge number of people coming over and we don't have the funds to... Sorry, cat again. One of the reasons it's not great is because there are a huge number of people that are just flooding over because they can do it at this point. And how do we fund that? It's not money that is really benefiting the United States. That money could go to better use. And,
I can agree with that.
but at the same time, we want to be able to care for the people that are coming over. So the problem that Trump is trying to solve with the wall is not, I don't think, out of xenophobia. I think it's out of, the problem is not that we have detention centers that are of lower quality than we would like. The problem is that there are too many people for the detention centers that we have. The problem is that there are too many people just flooding across the border. Again, 100,000 a month.
Yeah, that's not something that can be easily absorbed.
Right. Even if we do actually say, let's put all of our money to not just deporting, but giving housing to them and healthcare. 100,000 people a month, new, on top of the people that were there from the previous month. That's insane. It's something that can't be absorbed reasonably when we don't even have that sort of those sort of social programs for our own citizens. Giving that to people who aren't our citizens is even less reasonable, which is why the wall is supposed to, or in being just in general, enforcing the border is supposed to improve the ability of us to handle immigration. And right now, it's more difficult to have legal immigration when you have uncontrolled illegal immigration. And by the way, polls for how people feel about illegal immigration, legal immigrants also really, really dislike illegal immigrants because they ruin it and make the entire situation worse for everyone else, including just the stigma associated with immigrants.
Yep, I have a friend who legally immigrated from Mexico, and that is one of the things that he has told me about.
And again, I say this also as a son of an immigrant. Legal immigration I have no problem with. It's the uncontrolled illegal immigration that is problematic. And the fact that it's uncontrolled, the fact that people are leaving the country, again, with brain drain or even not, low-skilled labor is put to better use in the countries that they're coming from to improve those countries. It means that they're going to have a lower quality of life for a given time, but there's, I think it's a Chinese adage, bad times breed good people. Good people bring good times. Good times bring weak people. And weak people bring bad times. So there's a cycle. But the part that I'll focus on is bad times breed good people. Or breed strong people. Strong people bring good times. And I think a lot of people's view is that if you're just running away from the problems, then those strong people that are strong enough and willing enough to move across the world are not, they're breaking that cycle. And it's not the point in the cycle that you want to break, because you're currently in bad times. You want to get to the good times and then try and maintain the good times for as long as possible. If you are a strong person and then just leave before fixing the bad times, everything stays bad.
So, from a slightly different angle then, would we want to help incentivize those people to stay? Maybe provide foreign aid or something along those lines, in addition to us saying, no, you should stay in your country?
This is what we were talking about earlier with Engineers Without Borders, Doctors Without Borders, sending foreign aid, sending military assistance for whatever reason. And a lot of times military assistance ends up handing out food. You know, they're armed, but that's because the countries that they're handing out food in tend to be less secure, and so they want to be able to defend themselves. Also because we're bringing culture over to those countries that is hostile to them. You know, the idea of, for instance, in the Middle East, women's rights. We are a culture, or the West is a culture that believes that men and women are equal and should have equal recognition in the law. A lot of Middle Eastern countries, not all, but a lot of Middle Eastern countries follow things like Sharia law that believe that women are subservient to men. They are not equal. We are a threat to them. And that can be good or bad. From their perspective, it's very bad because we are literally threatening their way of life. Something that's contrary to what a lot of people believe. I've known soldiers that have fought in the Middle East. They were surprised that most of the reaction that they encountered was positive. That most of the citizens of those countries want Western culture. They view it as a positive. The people who don't are the extremists, and the extremists tend to be the people who end up getting the power and running the government. It does not mean that the majority of the people actually like it. I think that a reasonable proportion, possibly a majority, of people in Middle Eastern countries that follow laws that do not abide by Western values appreciate Western values. So us sharing our culture, like we mentioned with Doctors Without Borders, or even having military intervention, can have a positive effect if we enable those people to do more as they choose. And I think that's the goal of foreign interference, is to prop those individuals up. It's not to take over that country. It's to enable people to better use their skills and resources.
And what happens when they just don't have the skills? I know we talked about earlier, some of them going to universities in other countries, but what if nobody can do that?
That's where education is more important. And I think that as education can become more automated, so for instance with the internet, you have access to information much more readily. So for instance with healthcare, if we have health repositories of here's a bunch of information, here's how to deal with these particular illnesses, here's how to make medicine out of what you have, if we can set that up. And I think a lot of doctors want to do that because they want to be able to help people. For instance, Doctors Without Borders, that is the best way to improve the quality of life such that you can stop worrying about dying of common diseases and start worrying about building houses, making food. And I think that that's the goal of individuals who are voluntarily going to other countries and third world countries. That's what we're doing. But again, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, is the idea that that should be voluntary. Because it's the people that are most willing and most invested in being successful in that endeavor.
That does bring up a good point, though, about education. In that case, should people who want to give resources to these countries be focusing on giving them internet then, so they can access a lot of this information? There are some companies out there that are working on ways to provide internet to rural areas via satellite and other means.
For instance, SpaceX.
Right. So is that potentially a better use of this money rather than something like Doctors Without Borders or Engineers Without Borders?
It's arguably similar. But again, it comes down to the idea of, should we be forcing people? And I think that the best solutions come from people who are willingly partaking.
Right. So what I'm getting at is if we can provide them internet, so the people who want to make things better can have access to education and materials to make things better, is that more enabling than some of the other ways we could provide aid.
That is more enabling than just bringing people into first world countries from third world countries. Because in that case, they don't have to subscribe to a new culture. They don't have to learn a new language. I mean, depending on how good the translation software is, but arguably you don't need to concentrate on learning a new place of residence, how to get around, learning about transportation, how to manage money, how to interact with other individuals from a different culture, and learning a new language is a huge barrier to entry, something that most individuals would not be able to do. So if you just give them the ability to have access to the internet, that is arguably a better solution than migration. Also because you don't have to worry about building new housing or transportation of all those individuals.
It's a whole lot cheaper too.
It is. So I think rather than deal with building a bunch of detention facilities on a border, and this is borders in general, for between high quality and low quality countries or cultures, I guess is probably the better descriptor. Make a wall, or at least make it difficult enough to transfer from the low quality of life area to the high quality of life area that it's not worth trying. But at the same time, take some of those resources that you have that you're using to enforce the border to also improve the quality of life of individuals in the lower quality of life area. But again, it has to be voluntary. Secure your borders first. Protect the culture that you've built up, because obviously it's doing something right. If people are flocking to it, you're doing something right. And you should be able to manage for the individuals that want to help make that culture grow. Great. Have immigration so that you can continue bringing in new ideas. It's just as important. But keep it secure. And people within those areas will have a tendency to want to help other individuals. And that's where the benefit should come from first world to third world, is from goodwill. And it's a terrible thing to rely on of, oh, well, I'll just trust that this person, that everyone in this country has goodwill. Not everyone will, or at least not everyone will be willing to sacrifice some of their own benefits for other individuals.
Right, and I think that's where some of the government aid comes in. Because we do send a lot of aid to other countries.
Yeah, we do. And a lot of times, again, that's through the military, but it's through the military of, hey, we want to be able to protect the resources that we're sending over there to make sure that they're not abused.
Right.
And like you mentioned with internet. Internet is a Western invention, which is hugely pushing us forward. It is becoming easier and easier to provide that to the rest of the world. We are actually trying that. And people that have the resources to be able to do that are actively trying to do that. And even not in first world countries, in second world countries. I believe Russia is still considered a second world country. I believe China is as well. But huge numbers of people. And there are groups that are looking to provide internet that bypass those governments to be able to raise people's quality of life. And they're doing that because they want to. It's incredible that we have the more capabilities that you give people, the more they'll want to do. If they're able to do it, and that's part of the entrepreneurial spirit, that's part of the capitalist spirit, is the more people are capable of, and if you aren't limited in what you're able to do, the government isn't stopping you from doing more and benefiting from it, there's almost no limit to what you can do, which is why we have companies that are looking to provide cheap internet to the entire world. But it again comes from the goodness of people's hearts. And I think that the benefits from high quality of life countries to low quality of life countries needs to come from the goodness of people's hearts. But that assumes that they will do something about it. And that lack of security is something that I think a lot of people aren't comfortable with. They just want to have a central control agency that, no, we should just have this be controlled, and we should solve this problem so that everyone solves it. Have a government that forces all individuals to contribute. But that becomes authoritarian.
So now that we've come to the conclusion about how borders can be a good thing, why don't we talk a little bit more about the transportation over these borders and what can be done to make that better or in some ways easier for people?
Sure. We've established that borders can be beneficial for both the source and the target country. So should they be permeable? And in what ways should they be permeable?
Right. So in the U.S. today, we have a lot of different types of visas that people could get to come visit the country on a short-term basis. But there's also a path to citizenship. And this path can be pretty long and hard, requires taking tests, lots of lawyers, and eventually you get to become a citizen.
And I think part of the reason for that is ensuring that you are willing and capable of integrating yourself with our culture to make sure that you're compatible.
Right. But we could also maybe take this as an opportunity to make our country better in other ways too, like other paths to citizenship that help you get through this process a little bit sooner. So what if a person who committed to military service for a certain period of time could become a citizen faster?
If you're willing to come over to our country and fight for our country, we'll accept you as a citizen more quickly.
Right.
I think there's a huge security flaw in that.
Right. I feel like the military may not have been my best choice.
Yeah, and I understand the sentiment of if you're willing to fight and die for our country, well, yeah, welcome. But at the same time,
we got to be careful.
Insurgents would be a huge problem. It makes your military way too unsecure towards your enemies because they can just say, oh, well, hey, go over to that country, say that you want to live there, and fight for the army, in which case it would ruin it for other individuals that actually do want to fight for that country as a path to citizenship. If you have bad actors, it will spoil the bunch.
All right. How about something with lower stakes? Some sort of civil service.
So working for the government I view as also risky because government officials already get corrupt with power. So if you give, even to any degree, let's say you're just signing marriage certificates. What if you religiously object to, what if you're coming from a country that religiously objects to the idea of homosexuality at all, and your job is to sign marriage certificates? And let's say you try to be subtle about it. You don't sign them correctly. You look at homosexual marriage certificates, and you don't sign them correctly. And then after 5 years, you go back and discover like, oh, all of these are invalid. These people aren't married. And even if the state eventually recognizes them, it still brings up it'll be a huge amount of tax resources or government resources that need to get put towards correcting those mistakes. Working for the government, you could very easily sabotage various aspects of the government.
But surely there are some places where we could put these people if they wanted.
For instance, construction and contracts, so contract labor. Potentially, the risk with that is you're hovering a prize or dangling a prize behind hard labor. And hard labor, you have low risk of negatively affecting, although even in construction, people could sabotage the construction effort. And I acknowledge people that are citizens could also sabotage it, but it would open the doors for enemies of the state or enemies of your culture that want to destroy your culture. It would give them a way of easily coming in and destroying it. And I think the way that we currently do it, of, for instance, having work visas, of having temporary visas and saying, hey, you'll be able to work for a certain amount of time and then we'll review how you're doing. That's where we're at right now, is to prevent enemies of the state and enemies of the culture from just flooding in or taking advantage of it, or at least easily taking advantage of it. Ha! I've got you.
Yeah, part of the problem is time. Some of these waiting lists to become a citizen are years long. If you could cut your wait by, say, a year by working 6 months in trail construction in a national park, I mean, isn't that a good thing?
You are transitioning from one culture, one way of thinking to another. It should not be an easy process.
It definitely couldn't be easy, especially in many cases when you have to learn a new language.
Yep.
But already you've got to take... I know there's at least one test to become a citizen that requires you to know a whole lot of U.S. history and culture that even many U.S. citizens who were born here don't necessarily know.
And part of that is to try and help people integrate. So, for instance, something that a U.S. citizen will take for granted, the idea of we vote and democratically elect people. It's something that's just inherent to the way we think because it's how we grew up. We would see our parents, oh, it's voting day. Okay. We don't think about what that means necessarily when we're really young, and we eventually learn. People who are already adults that have never voted come over, they need to know how voting works, and so we teach them about it to help them integrate into that system. It's something that is not taught or as explicitly known for natural-born citizens because it's just something that we've been accustomed to and have a general knowledge of it versus and history as well. So, for instance, 4th of July, if you're going there, you may know the ideas of why we celebrate the 4th of July versus someone who is coming from another country may not know those ideas and needs to be taught them explicitly. But the goal of that is to help them integrate and know what to expect from the culture that they're moving into. It's to make that go more smoothly and go more quickly than just, hey, everyone can come in and good luck, everyone.
That does bring up a good point, though, of what parts of the culture are important for them to know to integrate into society.
Arguably, the parts that differentiate it from cultures that have lower qualities of life. And this, again, goes back to the idea of if you're running away from war, well, the culture that you were in somehow led to war. The culture that you're going to is not at war, so there are differences, and you should probably subscribe to that culture because they're not at war. So if you look at the differences between a country with high quality of life compared to a country with low quality of life, look at those differences, teach what those differences are, and that's what you should test on.
I think that could work.
And generally speaking, I think that's what we do. So for instance, with American history, we test on American history. What were the ideas that this country was founded on? You need to know those ideas explicitly. Because while a natural-born citizen will know them implicitly or have them at least be exposed to those ideas, someone from another country may have never heard of the idea of innocent until proven guilty. That's a miracle of modern law that we came to that we can't just assume you're guilty. Some people in the first world countries are starting to question that. Treating people as guilty until proven innocent, and the Me Too movement may be something that we want to talk about in a different episode. But innocent until proven guilty, I think, is a good example that people need to be taught that explicitly and tested on it because it's something that's implicit to individuals who grew up around it, and that helps teach people and is part of the education and integration into that new culture and makes it go more smoothly than just plopping you down and not helping you. So those tests and those limitations are a way of helping those people along.
Yeah, I can definitely agree that some of those limitations make sense. The biggest worry is just surely how long it can take. I understand that length of time being in a country definitely helps you integrate because you're immersed in it. You know, even learning a language, just being immersed in it, you learn so much more than just trying to read all of the words in a book.
Yep. But I think you're asking the wrong question. It's not how long does it take. It's how short can we make it. Integration into another culture is really hard to do. And I don't think it's, well, how long should we expect it to take? It's how short can we get it? And the education and the amount of involvement of the state is an attempt to make that process go more smoothly and be quicker.
I think a lot of my worry comes from, does it really make it any quicker?
And I've kind of been arguing the point that I think it does. because it helps teach people the values that they don't implicitly know that are associated with the culture that they're moving to.
But part of it is, how much does the test actually reflect real life culture? I know there are some things like the innocent until proven guilty that you mentioned that are a big deal.
How much does, in your everyday life, innocent until proven guilty come up?
Very rarely in the grand scheme of things.
In terms of a direct relation
Right.
to you, it's very rare. But for people all around you, it happens all the time. Because people all over the place are involved in the courts, and how we treat prisoners directly affects how society moves forward. So it's not a direct effect, but it's something that needs to be known. And if it's not known implicitly or through natural growth in that culture, it needs to be taught explicitly. And that's one of the critical components, again, with the idea of you're leaving a culture that failed in some way. You need to know as many of the things as possible in this new culture. And it's because switching cultures is so incredibly difficult. It takes a long time. And the best chance we can give people is to educate them to the best of our abilities. If we're not educating them in their in situ and leaving them in the country with a lower quality of life, and we're bringing them here, they've made the choice to take the difficult road. We're going to try and help them by educating them. It's not going to be an easy road. It's going to be a longer road than just educating them and letting them stay there. But they're choosing the longer road. And the people that are more successful at it and can pass the tests more quickly, they end up getting through faster. The people that it's more difficult for, they don't pass the tests, they aren't learning as quickly, it's going to take longer. But that is up to the person coming over and not a burden on the people. That, I think, is a burden of the person coming over and not of the target country.
Right, because I can't force someone to learn something, really.
Correct. If someone wants to become friends with you, if someone wants to become a sexual partner with you, is it your job to make that process efficient?
No.
You can be as tough as you want because you are granting permission to them. You are inviting them into your space. It should be on them to take however difficult of a road it is to earn over your trust. And once that trust is earned, then they are able to immigrate to your country. Does that address the concerns that you have with the legal immigration?
I think so.
It's very interesting how often the sex analogy has come up.
But it works.
It surprisingly well. And again, that legal immigration, voluntary sex, can be super great. Can have a super great result, taking two people, combining them, or two cultures and combining them, and making them greater than the sum of their parts. I think it's a great example in that regard. Also, when it's involuntary and you don't want the people coming over, it can be synonymous with rape. Because while the country where it's coming from, or the individual doing the raping, benefits from it and maybe may get some enjoyment out of it or increase their quality of life or happiness, you are taking away from the target country. Is that a xenophobic thing to say?
I'd argue no. In the grand scheme of things, you want things to be better, and having these people come over, share their culture, mix it with your own, makes things better.
But in order for things to mix, it has to be voluntary from both sides.
Right.
And if it's involuntary on one side, that is rape. But also recognizing the potential of voluntary joining can also be very good. And, like I said, I am the son of an immigrant. I'm glad that we came over here. I think I'm very happy with those decisions that have been made. And I think that as in the United States, as a country of immigrants at various times, we've done incredible things. And we can't forget that. Immigration is very important. It is critical, but it also needs to be handled in an intelligible way. And open borders would be just as destructive as invading other countries. Agreed?
Yeah.
I feel like I've kind of changed your mind on a lot of things in this topic.
Yes, but that's a good thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, we haven't been yelling at each other. We haven't been at each other's throats. And that's the whole point of these talks, is to talk about difficult things in difficult ways, in ways that you may not have thought of before. And if, again, for everyone listening, be respectful. The more respectful you are, the more willing people are to listen, and the more willing they will be to change their mind. And the whole point of what we're doing here is to try and bring people together who may not originally agree on things, and find some common ground, find differences in opinions that we didn't even know we held. And, people may be wondering, how do we prepare for these? We pick a topic. We figure out how broad do we want to make the topic. In this case, we were deciding whether or not to have just borders or just immigration. We figured they were too interconnected, so we made it into one topic. We said, okay, think about stuff and talk to you when we record it. That's how we prepare. Because we have our preconceived notions. We have ideas. Hash them out. See how they work. See where we go. We don't know where we're going to end up. These aren't scripted. But so, do you have anything that you wanted to add? Anything left unsaid that you've been thinking about?
Nope, I think we covered it all pretty well.
Awesome. Well, again, have fun in the comments, be respectful, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.